Hi, it's me, the storyteller. Thank you for joining me. Most of my stories on this channel are based on actual events, and some aren't. I'll let you decide if these stories are fiction, or if they're not. The northern woods of Georgia beckons adventurous souls seeking solace and connection with nature, a place where many go to camp, hike, and enjoy the vibrant scenery. For 33-year-old McKenna Ross, it promised a 3-day getaway filled with a quiet respite she desperately needed. What she didn't expect was an experience that would cause her such trauma she would need therapy for many years to come, as her so-called peaceful retreat would spiral into the nightmare of a lifetime. As an up-and-coming journalist at one of the largest news media companies in the United States, McKenna's future looked promising. Her career was taking off, and she was seeing a guy that had strong marriage potential. Although she didn't like to admit it, McKenna was a workaholic, but because that comes with a certain stigma, she often tried to reframe herself as just a go-getter, a highly driven woman who wanted to make something significant of her life. She lived in a hip and modern loft apartment in downtown Atlanta, where many of her days were spent working and working some more, to a point where her friends, family, and her so-called marriage prospect urged her to slow down and take a break. At some point, McKenna realized her work was truly consuming her, so she made the decision to block out a long weekend vacation. Being the type A personality she was, mixed with an adventurous spirit, she started looking at off-the-grid style Airbnb rentals. One that caught her attention was a converted fire lookout that boasted enchanting photos and guaranteed a stay to be remembered. It was pricey, but she hadn't splurged on much of anything in months, so she treated herself and booked a 3-night stay. On Friday, September 13th, 2019, McKenna drove to the Airbnb located just east of Blue Ridge, Georgia. This particular rental consisted of a 3-mile hike from the parking lot to the fire lookout. She hadn't done much hiking, but she was looking forward to the various trails close to where she'd be staying. She certainly didn't mind the exercise, as she was a faithful treadmill runner at her local gym. It was a calm, sunny day with a hint of fall on the horizon, a perfect start to her adventure. After parking her gray SUV near the trailhead, she texted her loved ones that she had completed the drive, and then vowed to turn off her cell phone once she used her All Trails app to get to her destination. As she locked up her SUV, she noticed an ATV Polaris-style vehicle approaching with a forest ranger behind the wheel. The ranger gave a slight wave and pulled to a stop at McKenna's car. He introduced himself as Officer Blake Reynolds. The two exchanged pleasantries and made a little small talk. After a moment, Officer Reynolds asked if McKenna was staying at the lookout. She normally wouldn't divulge that information under the normal circumstances, due to her growing reputation as a public figure, which had recently come with far too many creeps stalking her Instagram page. But she felt okay with telling him since he was an official ranger wearing the whole getup, including a sidearm in its holster, and appeared to be someone who could handle himself. He informed McKenna that there was a rechargeable walkie-talkie unit inside the lookout and to use Channel 2 if she needed any assistance. She thanked Officer Reynolds, who quickly insisted she call him Blake. This made McKenna smile. It made sense as he appeared to be around her age. She also couldn't help but notice he was easy on the eyes. As quickly as that thought came, McKenna threw it away. She really didn't need to entertain that. She turned, locked her car, and walked toward the trailhead. After about an hour or so, McKenna arrived at the lookout. It was massive and definitely over-delivered compared to the photos she saw on the website. She made her way up the 10 flights of stairs and punched in the code on the door that was provided by the owner. She stepped in and was immediately impressed by the accuracy and description of the place. It was a 1-bedroom, 1-bath, outfitted with a small kitchenette, furnished with a stove, refrigerator, and sink. It also had a quaint little wood-burning fireplace. Even more impressive was the balcony. McKenna knew she would find herself sitting out there in the morning, enjoying a hot cup of coffee. She walked over to the small dining table and found an information checklist, which gave the basic instructions on how to use the appliances, fireplace, and location of the first aid kit. It also included the Wi-Fi details, which she hoped not to be tempted to use. There was no cell phone service in the area, so having the Wi-Fi amenity at least gave her an option in a pinch. Finally, it gave instructions on the walkie-talkie sitting near the kitchen that Blake had described. This gave her some comfort knowing his story checked out. As McKenna settled into her rustic accommodations, the towering trees provided a comforting embrace while the sun dipped below the horizon. Her plan was simple: explore the vast trails, enjoy the silence of the forest, and recharge her spirit away from the clamorous city life. Armed with a backpack, a journal, and her overwhelming sense of freedom, she knew the entire experience was exactly what she needed. With a bit of daylight left, she wanted to check out the creek she noticed from the window, along with the trails that surrounded the area, so she could decide which one to explore the next day. She made her way to the bottom of the 60-foot tower and walked over to the creek. It was the perfect bubbling brook, which included the expected soundtrack of frogs and crickets to boot. She noted the nearby trails, and just as she was going to head back to the lookout and make herself some dinner, she heard rustling off in the distance. She scanned the area, hoping to catch a deer or any other cuddly creature, but to no avail. She turned to leave and heard it again, and still nothing. She wasn't surprised, as she realized her outdoor experiences were minimal, so her eyes weren't as trained as your typical outdoorsman. Over to her left, she noticed a small shed with a single door. She approached and discovered it was unlocked, so she entered to see what was inside. It was your typical storage shed with some tools and items to restock the lookout, such as toilet paper, extra firewood, and old furniture items. She also noticed a small generator with a couple of containers of gasoline, which she assumed was in case of a power outage. She thought she might have missed any details on the information sheet about the generator, so she would revisit that when she returned. After McKenna retreated to the lookout, she changed into her comfy PJs, started a fire, and made herself a bowl of hot soup. As she promised herself, she ignored her cell phone, fighting the urge to check emails. That's when she remembered to look at the information sheet again. Indeed, on the back of the paper was mention of the shed and instructions on how to use the generator in case of an outage. It seemed simple enough, but she wasn't concerned, knowing the only day that had a chance of rain was Sunday. McKenna crawled into bed and looked up at the stars through the skylight. She took in the view, and for the first time in a long time, she smiled and genuinely lived in the moment. Just as she was dozing off, she heard an odd howl coming from somewhere in the woods. She sat up and moved closer to the window to see if she could spot whatever it was. She heard it again. This time it was longer in duration. Curious, she got out of bed and stepped onto the balcony to see if she could see anything. She couldn't recall any animal that made that sound. It made the noise a few more times, and then it became extremely quiet. She walked back inside and got into bed, refusing to allow her mind to go anywhere near the creepy corners of her imagination. The sun surrendered to night, and McKenna fell asleep. The following day, McKenna fulfilled her goal of having coffee on the balcony while enjoying the crisp, cool morning. She planned an ambitious hike and was looking forward to getting started. She packed her gear, then made her way down to the bottom of the lookout. When she reached the bottom, she noticed something that wasn't there the day before. It appeared to be smeared, muddy footprints on the bottom few stairs of the lookout. She inspected them a little closer, and it looked as if the prints were made by bare feet, as she could make out the outline of toes. She knew they weren't hers. Plus, these were made by someone much larger. She quickly decided to be rational and attribute it to pareidolia, the psychological phenomenon of seeing recognizable shapes in random objects, like Corvette-shaped clouds or Jesus in a potato chip. She also assumed she'd missed it the night before because 1, her attention was on the spectacle of the lookout, and 2, it was getting dark as she was exploring, so she may have missed it. Besides, there wasn't a home or neighborhood for miles, and the nearest gas station was further than that. And why would someone be hiking without wearing shoes? She brushed it off and ventured out to the nearby 4-mile loop trail that began at the edge of the clearing. She decided that nothing was going to distract her from enjoying her first full day. The trail was calm, beautiful, and everything she'd hoped it would be. She saw the occasional squirrel, stopped at every stream, and took in every moment. At about the halfway point on her hike, McKenna stopped and sat on a large boulder to eat a snack and write in her journal. She breathed in the fresh, clean air, something she had taken for granted living in the big city. Then she noticed a pungent smell. It was foul. She knew it wasn't a skunk. She would have traded for that odor. Suddenly, she caught a shadowed figure in her peripheral. She scoured the area but didn't see it again. Then she heard a noise that could only be described as gibberish. an indistinct voice or voices she couldn't distinguish between human or animal. She listened further to see if she could make out the language, if it was a language, but it was nothing like she had ever heard. The sound abruptly ended, and McKenna just stood in silence. She grabbed her backpack and continued down the trail, wondering what could have made that sound, and if it was the shadowed figure she briefly caught a glimpse of. She speculated her mind may have been playing tricks on her as her spirit grew more unsettled, but she was optimistic that the many hours of daylight left would dispel any lingering fears. She decided she would call Blake on the walkie when she returned to the lookout and ask a few questions, hoping she wouldn't come across as some paranoid city girl. McKenna returned to the tower around 2 p.m., and despite what happened earlier by the boulder, she enjoyed her hike. She dropped her gear, then took the walkie from the charger and stepped onto the balcony. She made sure it was on channel 2 and called Blake. He answered right away, and McKenna told him about the footprints, what she possibly saw in the woods, and the odd vocalization she heard. He replied that he hadn't had any other reports, but if it would make her feel better, he'd come to the tower to take a look around. So she took him up on the offer. This gave McKenna a sense of relief, hoping he would find a simple explanation for all of it, even if it meant a little embarrassment. Blake told her to sit tight and that he would be there in an hour or so. After taking a shower and making herself something to eat, McKenna sat on the balcony and waited for Blake to arrive. It wasn't long until she heard the ATV approaching. She got up and met him at the bottom of the stairs. She showed him the prints on the stairs, which he found strange but also a little inconclusive. They walked the perimeter and talked about what McKenna had heard. Blake theorized that it could have been a fox or a cougar, as they can sometimes sound like human voices. McKenna felt good about that explanation and walked him back to his ATV. He told her he hadn't seen any mountain lions for quite some time, and that the area was, for the most part, very safe. He reassured her that if any time she felt unsafe, not to hesitate to call him again. He chuckled at the fact that it was more excitement than he'd seen in weeks, and any excuse to get out of the ranger station was a treat. McKenna wondered if this was his way of being flirtatious. She noticed, along with his good looks, Blake had a strong and confident demeanor. She thanked him again and watched him drive away. After watching the world turn blue, McKenna climbed into bed and journaled some more before going to sleep. Around 2 a.m., she jolted awake to a knocking sound coming from the distant trees. She peered out of the window next to her bed. The moon was putting on a show, so she could see surprisingly well. She heard the knocks again and determined it sounded more manufactured than something organic in nature. McKenna found a flashlight in one of the drawers in the kitchen and again, like the night before, stepped onto the balcony. She shined the light in different areas of the tree line, attempting to catch a glimpse of anything. Then she heard a screech, similar to the tone and pitch from what she had heard on the trail. She shined the light in every direction. Then it screeched again. Whatever it was, it had eluded her. She could hear it moving through the woods, and eventually it faded away to nothing. At this point, McKenna was a little freaked out, but more than anything, her journalistic instinct kicked into high gear, so she decided to open her phone, connect to the Wi-Fi, and do some research. She Googled fox and cougar sounds, watched a few videos, and convinced herself they didn't quite match what she'd heard. She gave it some thought, then caught a memory from the beginning of her college years at Syracuse. In one of her classes, she recalled a couple of nerdy, tinfoil hat type of guys that did a group project on creepy stories that involved Bigfoot, unusual disappearances, and other American legends. They discussed one particular story about a boy that went missing in the Smoky Mountains in the 1960s. The students suggested he may have been taken by a Bigfoot, as a witness described someone or something large traversing through the woods, making loud, screeching noises and carrying something on its shoulder. McKenna dug a little deeper, and it didn't take long until she found the story. After reading old news articles, she was even more intrigued and decided to search Bigfoot howls. That's when she stumbled upon strange sounds that were recorded in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California during the 1970s. As she listened, she couldn't believe what she was hearing. The voices sounded like a foreign language, but one that she had never heard. After more digging, she found that the recordings had been professionally analyzed and concluded they were not coming from human vocal cords. She laughed to herself, thinking how ridiculous it was, but she listened again and again, and each time she played it back, the more she was convinced it was similar to what she'd heard on the trail. She searched one more detail before calling it quits, and that was the exact location of where the boy from the 1960s went missing in the Smoky Mountains. Her heart palpitated when she discovered it was only a few hours' drive from her location. In that moment, McKenna contemplated cutting her trip short and heading back to Atlanta. After mostly a sleepless night, McKenna rose out of bed around 10 a.m. The bright sunny day evoked a bit of comfort compared to what she'd experienced and researched just hours ago. She made herself some coffee and breakfast, then recounted what she'd uncovered online. She could admit she freaked herself out, and maybe, just maybe, she was overreacting. She took in a deep breath and reminded herself it was her last day and night, and she'd be back in her loft before she knew it, drinking wine and sharing these wild memories with her friends. She decided she wouldn't let 50-year-old stories, viral videos, and monster legends ruin her vacation. Once the caffeine kicked in, she reset her mind and left on a hike that promised a gorgeous view at the beautiful Blue Ridge Lake. But this time, she took the walkie-talkie with her. She knew if she could reach Blake from the tower, she could possibly reach him where she was going, and this gave her a boost of confidence. McKenna followed the sign for the Blue Ridge Lake Trail and marched ahead. A couple of hours went by, and McKenna reached Blue Ridge Lake. She hadn't heard or seen anything unusual, so she was thankful she could focus on herself and the time she had left. After eating her packed lunch, she was about to check out the other side of the lake when she heard a rumble of thunder in the distance. She guessed the small percentage of rain in the forecast may turn into one more likely. It was clear from where she stood, but due to the tall trees that blocked the sky, she was unsure of how close the storm was. She tabled the idea of exploring the other side of the lake and decided to head back to the lookout. Just then, an enormous splash came from the shoreline. She whipped her head and caught the tail end of it, thinking it could have been a fish. She approached the area and noticed a good-sized rock in the water, a few feet from the bank. The ripples were still emanating from it. She looked toward the woods curiously, and her mind went back to what she'd researched. McKenna fought the urge to go there in her mind. Then another rock flew past her, hitting the water behind her. She knew it had been thrown at her. She called out to whatever it was, asking if anyone was there. Another crack of thunder came, but this time a bit closer, so she immediately gathered her things and remembered the walkie-talkie. She pulled it from her pack and walked swiftly down the trail. She called Blake and received a crackled response, but she kept trying. She repeated over and over she was on the Blue Ridge Lake Trail and felt she was being stalked and possibly attacked. Her inner tension rose. Another rumble of thunder came simultaneously with Blake's voice on the walkie, but McKenna believed she caught the words Blue Ridge. She leaned into her muscle memory and began to run at a steady pace, convinced she had the stamina to make it to the tower without stopping. She concentrated on her breathing and stayed alert of where she stepped. The sky darkened fast, and then came the rain. McKenna heard the screech again and felt the rush of something approaching. She glanced back and saw a humanoid-like figure scurry off the trail. Her heart pounded, hoping at any second Blake would appear on the trail. Just then, she was knocked down as something pounced on her back and began scratching and biting her backpack. It snarled and screeched. McKenna squirmed and fought. Without warning, a gunshot rang out. The entity released McKenna's backpack and disappeared. She pulled herself from the muddy soil and saw Blake straight away, standing next to the Polaris with his firearm pointing to the sky, the barrel still smoking from the gunshot. McKenna ran toward Blake and threw herself in his arms. She was drenched and muddy, but it didn't matter. She was safe. They hopped in the ATV and drove back toward the lookout. Blake drove with purpose, while McKenna asked him repeatedly what attacked her, but Blake struggled to find the words. He admitted it was very dark, but from where he stood, it wasn't an animal, but in fact looked human. McKenna was just glad he had arrived when he did. She looked on as they raced toward the lookout. By the time Blake and McKenna arrived at the tower, the storm had intensified. They parked close to the lookout, and once inside, Blake started a fire while McKenna poured coffee. The storm raged, and by this point, it was so dark outside, the 5 o'clock hour looked like 10 p.m. Blake tried radioing the station, as he expected another ranger to begin their shift, but all he got was static. He could sense McKenna was still shaken by the incident, so he reassured her he wouldn't leave her alone until he could get her back to her car safely. But they had to sit tight and wait for the storm to pass. Minutes later, McKenna put on her journalist hat again and asked Blake if there had been any recent sightings of this thing, and he replied he had heard no such reports. Suddenly, lightning struck the tower. The power surged, and then black. The power had gone out. In one split second, the brief and secure atmosphere became dark and vulnerable, the only light coming from the wood-burning stove. Blake tried his walkie again. Nothing. He mentioned he needed to find the breaker box to see if he could reset it, and assumed it had to be on the tower somewhere, likely ground level. That's when McKenna remembered the generator inside the shed. Blake felt good about that idea as a backup plan. After grabbing the flashlight from the counter, he told McKenna to stay put and headed for the door. McKenna asked if he was worried about that thing coming back. He gently tapped his fingers on his sidearm and grinned with confidence before he stepped out into the rain and descended the stairs. A few moments went by. McKenna stepped onto the balcony and leaned over the railing to see if she could spot Blake down below. She called out for him and sighed in relief as he stepped out from under the tower. The rain fell harder, so she couldn't make out his response, but she believed he said he'd found the breaker box before he tucked out of sight. Then, something caught McKenna's eye, moving near the edge of the tree line. To her dismay, she made out the outline of a figure creeping slowly on all fours toward the lookout. McKenna screamed for Blake, but the rain and thunder drowned her voice. She rushed to the stairs and made her way down, stopping halfway, trying to find the figure, but she couldn't trace it. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream came from below, followed by another gunshot. McKenna ran down the remaining stairs, and when she reached the bottom, she came upon a shocking sight. That thing was hunched over Blake's lifeless body, biting and chewing the flesh from his neck in a frenzy. McKenna screamed, and that's when the figure turned to reveal itself. It was a man, a feral, wild man, emaciated, covered in mud and filth, wearing torn hospital scrubs. The man hissed through his teeth, his face covered in Blake's blood. McKenna backed away slowly, her heart racing, soul filled with fear, as the man stared at her with deranged eyes. She saw Blake's pistol lying a few feet away from him, so she knew that wasn't an option. If she turned to run, this monster would attack. She continued to back up until she bumped into the Polaris. That was it. She quickly went through the motions in her mind. Jump in the ATV, turn the ignition, throw it into gear, and speed toward her car. She ran it through again, each step. Then she paused and counted down in her mind. 1, 2, 3. McKenna jumped into action and leaped into the ATV and almost seamlessly turned the ignition. It fired up, but in that split second, the wild man was on her. She braced her 125-pound frame on the wheel, and as the man lunged, McKenna kicked him in the chest. He tumbled backward to the ground, giving her the chance to put the ATV in drive and step on the gas pedal. She peeled away, heading toward the 3-mile trail that led to her car. She looked over her shoulder and saw the man in pursuit, running on all fours, like an animal, chasing down its prey. But he was no match for the speed of the ATV. McKenna floored it. The rain pelted her face, feeling like 1,000 needles, but she didn't care. She had escaped. By the time McKenna reached her car at the parking area, the rain had let up as the storm had almost completely blown over. Then it came to her that she neither had her keys nor her cell phone. In her haste, she had left them back at the tower. That's when she thought of Blake. Though doubtful, hoped he was still alive. She returned to the ATV and drove down the road that led her out of the park until she ran into the ranger station. There, she located another park ranger just beginning his shift. She rushed to explain the events that transpired and urged the ranger to call 911, that Officer Reynolds had been attacked and injured. In half an hour, authorities and emergency medical teams arrived at the ranger station, and McKenna directed them to the lookout. They discovered Blake still lying on the ground under the tower, bloodied, but thankfully, still alive. He was taken to a local hospital where he received treatment to his neck and shoulder and was expected to make a full recovery. The following day, the state park closed as an investigation that included law enforcement and state park officials went underway. It wasn't long, and the wild man was discovered, found deceased in a small rock shelter not far from Blue Ridge Lake. He had apparently died of starvation. The man was identified as 55-year-old Edward Bell. Bell was a resident at Summit Hill, a mental health facility south of Knoxville, Tennessee, about 100 miles away, as officials assumed he had wandered off of the premises and became lost. Without supervision and medication, Bell's mental state became too far gone. He had indeed become feral, a modern-day wild man living in the northern woods of Georgia. In recent time, rumors and stories of feral people living in remote areas of the mountains has caught the attention of online internet sleuths investigating missing people from national parks. Some have captured viral videos and photos depicting the claims, but most have been debunked. Regarding the Airbnb rental, it was shut down until after the investigation, but reopened in 2020. It has gained popularity due to the events that took place and is typically booked many months in advance, mostly by popular content creators. As for McKenna Ross, she couldn't escape the headlines with her position at the news organization, but eventually wrote the piece, highlighting her experience, gaining credibility in her career. The trauma she experienced was unimaginable and required a lot of counseling and support from her friends and family. McKenna was married in 2022 and is now enjoying her new life with her husband, Officer Blake Reynolds. In the heart of North Dakota, where prairie meets water and silence stretches wide beneath endless sky, lies Devil's Lake, a sprawling body of water that gleams beneath the sun and shimmers under moonlight. Tourists come for the fishing, the camping, the serenity. Locals revere it for its beauty, for the sense of quiet that settles over its surface like a veil. But not all is calm beneath that stillness. For some, Devil's Lake carries a different weight, an unspoken tension that surfaces only in hushed conversations and long glances at the tree line. And for one family in particular, the lake is now etched into memory by something far darker than folklore or faded warnings. It's the place where their son disappeared, the place where a child simply vanished. It was June 2021, a warm Saturday. Families had flocked to the park early that morning. The gravel lots filled with trucks and campers. Lawn chairs were unfolded, bait boxes prepared, sunscreen and sandwiches passed around. The wind off the lake was calm, the kind of day that invites you to forget the world. Among the families was the Masons, a mother, father, and their 7-year-old son Ethan. They'd staked out a spot near the southern inlet, where the tree line begins to climb gently into a wooded ridge. It was a familiar place. They'd camped here before. Ethan loved the woods, often darting just out of sight, pretending to be an explorer or a ranger. It was part of the routine. He would simply disappear for a few minutes, return triumphantly with pine cones, feathers, and sticks shaped like swords. That day felt no different, until it was. Late that morning, Ethan's parents noticed he was gone longer than usual. The playful shouts had gone quiet. His father called out first, then louder. The mother checked the nearby trail, thinking maybe Ethan had wandered back to the trailer, but each direction held only stillness. No crunching leaves, no running footsteps, no child. Panic settled in with the first unanswered call. Within the hour, park rangers were notified. By afternoon, local search teams had also arrived. Dogs, volunteers, drones, boats. They swept the woods, traced the lake's edge, knocked on camper doors. Helicopters scanned from above, but no trace of Ethan emerged. No clothing and no shoe prints. It was as though the forest had taken him and left no sign it ever had. The official search continued for over a week. Press conferences were held, flyers went up. Locals brought food to volunteers, and vigils were lit each night. The community rallied, as small towns do when tragedy strikes. But beneath the organized chaos of a missing person case, something else was stirring. Quietly at first. Whispers. There were older folks who remembered stories, campers who'd heard things in the night, strange howls, neither coyote nor wolf. Glimpses of something tall, upright, but wrong in its gait. A shadow, not shaped like a man, not shaped like anything that should be walking on two legs. The legend wasn't new, not by a long stretch. In fact, variations of the creature had been spoken of for decades across the Great Lakes and the Midwest. A humanoid beast, canine in features, but far larger. It stood like a man, but with the strength and instincts of a predator. Some said it was a remnant of something ancient. Others, something supernatural, a protector of the wild, or a curse upon it. At Devil's Lake, the tales had always stayed below the surface, a story for late nights, for campfires, and warnings to city folk. But in the days after Ethan disappeared, the legend took on new weight. The Dogman theory surged online. Local forums lit up, then broader paranormal sites. Videos emerged of alleged sightings, blurry images taken on hiking trails. One camper claimed to have heard deep, guttural breathing just outside his tent that very week. Another reported a figure crouching at the tree line, unmoving, watching. Authorities dismissed it. Officials focused on practical leads. They believed Ethan had wandered too far, gotten lost, maybe even slipped into one of the hidden water pockets along the ridge. It was a tragedy, but tragedies typically have explanations. Still, no body was found, no dropped toy, no trail of the boy. For some, the lack of evidence became evidence itself. Hunters began to share their own accounts, encounters they'd never told their wives or friends. A silhouette in their scope that vanished before they could fire. A smell, wet dog and rot, strong enough to make the skin crawl. Scratch marks on trees too high for any known animal. And so the Dogman theory evolved, from urban legend to plausible suspect in a case with no other explanation. Ethan's parents never spoke publicly about the theory, but locals noted that they stopped returning to the lake. Their campsite, once visited every summer, remained vacant the following year. Their home, once lit up with birthday signs and yard toys, fell quiet. By 2022, the official search had scaled back. The trail had gone cold. The story slipped from national news but remained a scar on the community. The boy who vanished without a sound. The case with no resolution. Today, hikers tread carefully along the southern ridge of Devil's Lake. Some carry trail whistles, others wear bear bells. But a few carry something deeper, an unease they don't fully understand. They don't camp too close to the trees. They don't wander off alone, not after dark. And if they do, they don't speak about what they hear, because the legend isn't just a story anymore. It's become part of the land, woven into the wind, the leaves, the echoes across the water. And until Ethan is found, Devil's Lake will never feel the same. Whether the Dogman is real or not no longer matters. What matters is that a child vanished, and the forest didn't give him back. In the spring of 2002, the forests of Tahquamenon Falls State Park became the backdrop of a terrifying experience for two recent medical graduates. Mariah Cooper, 28, and her friend Hannah McCrary, 27, set out on what was meant to be a celebratory camping trip, commemorating their hard-earned degrees. Instead, their long-awaited adventure morphed into an unimaginable nightmare. This unbelievable tale serves as a cautionary reminder of the importance of safety awareness while camping in the vast wilderness. Mariah Cooper and Hannah McCrary met during their college journey in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and became fast friends. They discovered they both had a lot of common interests, including their love for hiking and nature itself. They often spent the weekends exploring various trails in and around some of Michigan's beautiful wooded landscapes. Excited to celebrate their graduation, the two women planned a getaway to the beautiful remote vistas of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Known for its lush forests and stunning waterfalls, the Tequamanon State Park seemed like the perfect escape. It had been on their bucket list for some time, so they couldn't wait to finally make it a reality. Little did they know, their trip would descend into the most frightful event of their lives. One that would end with only one of them living to tell the tale. On May 31st, 2002, Hannah and Mariah made the 5-hour drive from Grand Rapids to Tequamanon State Park in Hannah's new red Honda Civic, a graduation gift from her parents. They listened to their favorite music, laughed, and talked about their upcoming weekend before arriving at the Lower Falls parking lot around 4 p.m. Surprisingly, there were no other cars in the area. With a few hours of daylight left, they wanted to get to the backcountry campsite near Clark Lake so they could set up their camp and enjoy the sunset. After double-checking their backpacks, the two of them began their 3-day adventure on the Upper and Lower Falls Trail. A couple of hours later, they arrived at Clark Lake. It was as beautiful as the pictures they had seen on the internet. They took some time taking their own photos with Mariah's old-school Polaroid camera she borrowed from her mother. Taking selfies was a bit of a challenge since cell phones with cameras hadn't quite made their introduction. After setting up camp and starting a fire, they cooked dinner and enjoyed the setting sun while chatting about life, relationships, and of course the next chapter of their new careers. Before they turned in and retreated to their tent, Mariah stepped away to relieve herself while Hannah cleaned up camp and placed their extra food items in a nearby bear box. Both were seasoned campers and fully understood the prudence of using the buddy system, whether in the wilderness or at the many college parties and nightclubs they attended while they were in school. When Mariah was walking back to camp, she noticed how quiet the forest had become and realized she hadn't heard or seen much wildlife since they had arrived. Oddly, she couldn't remember seeing any other people on the trail either. Later, as they nestled in their tent, Mariah zipped the tent closed, commenting on how much chillier it had gotten, then asked Hannah if she remembered seeing anyone else since they'd arrived, but she couldn't recall. They joked about not getting too creeped out of the possibility of being alone in the entire park, as it was unlikely to be the case, being they were on the cusp of summer. To calm any unspoken fears, they talked about the day ahead and the memories they would make before falling asleep. The next morning, the women woke to the sound of the trees blowing in the breeze. It felt abnormally frigid, despite staying bundled in their sleeping bags. Something didn't feel quite right, and when they sat up, they understood why, as their eyes adjusted to a troubling sight. Their tent was completely unzipped. They looked at each other in unison, eyes wide. Did one of them wake in the middle of the night to pee and forget to close it? Hannah quickly stated it wasn't her. She was about to ask Mariah the same thing, but before she could get the words out, Mariah shook her head no. Both undoubtedly recalled Mariah zipping the tent shut before they bedded down. Their hearts dropped to the pit of their stomach when they came to the realization that someone or something had opened their tent in the middle of the night. After getting dressed, Hannah and Mariah sipped coffee and ate granola. They tried to soothe each other's fears by presenting any other possibilities that could have resulted in their tent being opened, knowing in their hearts it could only be the most obvious. Once they packed up camp, they began the next 7-mile leg of their hike, hoping they could forget the unsettling feeling weighing on their minds. For a while, they walked in silence, looking over their shoulders and attempting to stay alert of their surroundings. After a mile or two, they arrived at a beautiful waterfall. The gorgeous view calmed their troubled spirits. They took more photos and tried to forget the morning's events. After eating a snack and rehydrating, Hannah and Mariah hopped back on the trail. Mariah bent down to retie her hiking boot. Suddenly, she heard the sound of a twig break deep in the woods. She snapped her head toward the noise. About 30 yards into the forest, she noticed what looked like a bending or refracting of light. Thinking it was just a mote in her eye, she rubbed it, then blinked a few times. But it was still there. Then it shifted behind a tree and disappeared. Mariah jogged a bit to catch up to Hannah and asked if she'd heard the sound, but she hadn't. Both agreed that Mariah was still a bit jumpy from what happened earlier. However, Mariah kept what she saw to herself and secretly hid her rising inner feeling they were being watched. The rest of the day was uneventful, and around 3 p.m., they arrived at their next campsite, near the Tequamanon River. Mariah began pitching their tent as Hannah walked the perimeter, gathering firewood. Mariah kept her sights on Hannah, making a concerted effort to stay cognizant of their environment. Meanwhile, Hannah sauntered through the grass at the edge of the tree line, holding a handful of wood. As she bent down to pick up one last piece, a deer bolted out of the woods, startling her, causing her to drop her plunder. She shrieked and held her chest tightly, watching the deer run across the open area of the campsite. She noticed Mariah watching as well. They both acknowledged each other and smiled in response. When Hannah bent down to gather the scattered firewood, she heard more rustling in the distant foliage. She scanned the area expecting another deer, and to her disbelief, she noticed something she couldn't explain. It appeared to be a transparent blob-like figure resting into a still position, as if slowing to a stop. Hannah squinted, holding her gaze on whatever it was. She blinked and it was gone. Her eyes darted back and forth, trying to locate it again, but she couldn't see it. Like Mariah, she too felt like she was being watched. She trotted back to Mariah, who was just finishing up the tent, and tossed the wood on the ground. Mariah started to mention the deer, but Hannah quickly interrupted her, telling her she saw something in the woods she couldn't explain. After a beat of silence, Mariah shared what she had seen back at the waterfall. Trying to make sense of it, Hannah described it as being camouflaged, looking similar to the creature from a movie she saw with her brother when she was 14, called Predator, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger. Mariah had seen the same movie and agreed that no matter how silly it sounded, it was the most accurate description. The women were beside themselves and wondered if the deer that startled Hannah and ran out of the woods was running from what they saw. Was whoever or whatever it was responsible for opening their tent? They thought they could have been overreacting, allowing their imaginations to run wild, but they reassured each other they weren't crazy. Far from it. They were medical grads, for goodness sake, with official letters that came after their names. Suddenly, a whistling sound came from the direction of the tree line, but it didn't sound like a bird. It was more like someone signaling someone else. Both acknowledged the situation felt increasingly uneasy and didn't sit right with either of them. The growing impression of being stalked had become a very real possibility. Hannah quickly grabbed her backpack and dug out her Nokia cell phone and noticed the battery was almost dead. Plus, there was no service, which was not really a surprise, considering where they were. In that moment, she remembered she had forgotten to call her parents to let them know they had made it to the park. Mariah checked her cell phone as well, but with the same result: no service. Their instinct for self-preservation set in. Without haste, they decided to pack up and try to hike out of the park, knowing that reaching Hannah's car before dark would be a tall order, since the sun was already going down. They figured if they moved at a rapid pace, they'd make it to Hannah's car by roughly 9 p.m. Darkness descended upon the park, and it was becoming a little harder to see. As they made their way swiftly down the trail, they took small breaks for water. Their fears intensified, a feeling that crescendoed as time passed. Without warning, Mariah stumbled and fell to the ground, holding her ankle. Hannah dropped her pack and rushed to her aid. That's when they noticed what Mariah had tripped over. A deer was lying slightly off the path, with an arrow sticking out of its neck. They wondered if it was the same deer they saw before. Regardless, hunting season was still months away. This fueled their growing distress. As Hannah helped Mariah to her feet, they heard a swish sound, like something cutting through the air. Without warning, an arrow burst through the front of Hannah's thigh, spurting blood onto Mariah's face. Hannah screamed in pain and fell to the ground. Mariah moved to help her and quickly noticed some sort of cable attached to the back of the arrow sticking out of Hannah's leg. She examined it closer and realized the arrow wasn't your normal wooden arrow. This one was made out of solid metal material. Mariah tried her best to focus on any medical training she could remember, but like Hannah, she was also in shock. Neither one of them had any real trauma experience. Then, another sound emerged that could only be described as a high-pitched winch or fishing reel. Suddenly, Hannah's body jolted and was dragged off the trail and into the forest. Mariah gave chase. She dove and grabbed Hannah's hand, but her grip wasn't strong enough, and Hannah slipped away, pulled into the forest, her screams echoing in darkness. Mariah pulled herself off the ground and realized there was nothing more she could do. She needed to get to Hannah's car if there was any chance of getting help. She rummaged through Hannah's backpack and took her keys. As she stood, another arrow zipped past Mariah, barely missing her, striking a nearby tree. That one came from the opposite side of the trail. In that moment, she realized whoever or whatever was out there, there were two of them. Mariah bolted from the scene back to the trail and ran as fast as she could. Her survival mode set in, and her adrenaline pumped so hard that she forgot about her ankle. The only thing she could think of was, could she make it to the car before she was taken out? She cried as she ran, thinking of her best friend and the horror that had unfolded. She could hear the whistling she heard earlier that day, but she didn't look back. She ran faster and faster until she could see the streetlight coming from the parking lot. Her plan was to drive out of the park as fast as she could and call 911 as soon as she had service on her cell phone. Mariah arrived at Hannah's car exhausted, out of breath, but also relieved. But her relief was short-lived. When she approached the Honda Civic, her heart sank when she noticed all 4 tires were slashed. She pulled out her cell phone, but barely had any battery life. She tried 911, but still didn't have service. Hopeless and out of options, she made the decision to head out of the park on foot. Moments later, a forest ranger approached in a state park SUV. Mariah waved him down and explained what had happened. The ranger took Mariah to safety, and a massive search for Hannah was immediately launched. State, local, and federal authorities were involved. Mariah and Hannah's family arrived the next day, but authorities kept them out of the search area to prevent the search and rescue dogs from confusing their scents. Mariah returned with investigators to where the women were attacked and was able to point out the tree with markings of where an arrowhead piece had been pulled from the bark. Unfortunately, the dead deer she tripped over could not be located. 2 days passed and no trace of Hannah could be found. Despite very few clues, there remained a shadow of skepticism regarding Mariah's account. Authorities could not locate any other evidence of the person or persons whom she claimed had stalked them, leading some to question the validity of her story. That a figure, dressed in camouflage, that resembled a creature from a sci-fi film, hunted them like animals. Mariah knew it sounded crazy, but she was consistent in her story. A few weeks later, back home in Grand Rapids, Mariah was going through her backpack and pulled out the Polaroid photos her and Hannah had taken before their trip turned for the worst. As she flipped through them, she cried at the thought of her friend being taken, being pulled into that wooded abyss. Studying one of the selfies they had taken by the lake, she noticed something chilling in the background. It was what appeared to be the camouflaged figure crouching near the tree line. She submitted the photo to authorities, but according to investigators, they shrugged it off as a lighting artifact of the lens due to some overexposure in the picture. In October, only 4 months later, a middle-aged couple was hiking off trail with their English Springer Spaniel into Quamanon State Park. During their hike, the dog began sniffing and barking at some underbrush in a clearing where they had stopped to eat lunch. The couple went to see what was causing the dog to react in this way, and when they inspected the area, one of them stepped on what sounded like metal. They wiped away some of the dirt and leaves and discovered a metal door with a handle. They lifted the door and swung it open, revealing a grisly sight. It appeared to be an abandoned man-made bunker, roughly 7 feet deep. The couple marked the area, left the park, and called the sheriff. Authorities arrived and conducted a thorough investigation. What they uncovered not only validated Mariah's story, but it would haunt those that visit the state park for years to come. The underground bunker contained 5 human skeletons hanging on the walls, displayed like trophies, an extremely disturbing sight that rivaled the scariest of horror films. Even more puzzling were 2 military-grade ghillie suits, fashioned with diamond-shaped mirror pieces covering them from top to bottom. When the suits were examined, they appeared to be very well designed and looked almost invisible to the naked eye in almost any environment, again confirming what Mariah perpetuated. In addition to the suits, metal arrowhead pieces were collected that matched the markings in the tree, near where the incident had taken place, and exactly as Mariah had described in her statements. When the coroner's office studied the skeletal remains, They were able to identify 3 out of the 5 corpses. Sadly, one was identified to be that of Hannah McCrary. Due to the extreme decomposition of the remains, causes of death were undetermined. The families didn't know how to process the horrifying news. As for the other 2 Jane Does, they continued to be a mystery. Those close to the investigation asked the questions: were the suits constructed by a secret military program in which the women became unwitting participants in a dark black ops experiment? Or were the perpetrators just a couple of criminally insane individuals playing a sick game of hunting human beings for sport? Whoever stalked and hunted Mariah and Hannah in Michigan's Upper Peninsula was never found, as the case has remained open until any new leads emerge. Hannah McCrary's family erected a memorial in her name and the others who were lost in the Tequamanon State Park. Mariah visits the memorial every year with Hannah's family on the anniversary of their fateful trip to remember her best friend and the wonderful memories they shared. In the vast, unforgiving reaches of Idaho's Sawtooth wilderness, where jagged peaks tear into the sky and pine forests stretch for miles unbroken, there lingers the story of a woman whose name still echoes among the trees. Ida Murray, forest ranger, naturalist, trailblazer. In 1967, at the age of 71, she disappeared during what should have been a routine patrol, but nothing about what followed could be called routine. To those who knew her, Ida was a fixture of the wilderness. She had dedicated her life to these mountains, this land, long before conversation was fashionable or women wore the ranger's badge. Her small frame belied the strength within, and her quiet demeanor masked the fierce determination that had carried her through decades of service. She was not simply respected, she was revered. The wilderness wasn't a job for Ida. It was a home, and she knew it better than most know their own neighborhoods. She was last seen in late August 1967. That morning had dawned warm, with the haze of wildfire smoke drifting lazily between the peaks, common enough in those summers. Ida packed lightly, as she always did, just her rucksack, journal, water flask, and a few provisions. She was heading into a familiar zone west of Redfish Lake, tasked with checking trail conditions, marking erosion patterns, and observing wildlife behavior. She left a note at the ranger station. She expected to return by sundown, but Ida never came back. When she missed her evening radio check-in, her fellow rangers were concerned, but not alarmed. Ida had spent unplanned nights in the backcountry before. Still, by the next morning, unease had turned to dread. A search team mobilized. Dogs were brought in. Helicopters made low passes over the canyons. Rangers hiked every known trail, calling her name into the pines, listening for any reply. Days passed, then weeks. No sign. Not a torn scrap of clothing, not even a boot print. Not a single page from her journal. The ground, it seemed, had swallowed her whole. The terrain didn't help. The Sawtooths are beautiful, yes, but beautiful in a way. A thunderstorm is beautiful. It hides danger. Sheer rock faces, hidden ravines, fast-moving creeks, snowfields that persist into summer. In some places, the undergrowth is so dense that you could walk within 10 feet of someone and never know it. Still, to vanish without a trace, for someone as experienced and skilled as Ida, that was harder to understand. Rumors began to stir, not among the rangers, who clung to practical explanations, but in nearby towns like Stanley and Ketchum. Some whispered about accidents, others about foul play. A few, more quietly, mentioned something stranger. There had been sightings, they said, strange shapes moving upright in the forest. Reports of strange howls echoing through the valleys in the weeks before her disappearance. The term Bigfoot was whispered, not spoken out loud, of course. Most dismissed it, but even skeptics admitted that the wilderness could be odd. Unexplained things had happened here. 7 years passed. In 1974, a trio of backpackers, college students from Boise, were making their way along the Salmon River Trail. The summer was dry. The rivers were low. One of them wandered a short distance off trail in search of firewood and stumbled upon something pale, caught between two boulders. At first, they thought it was driftwood. It wasn't. Authorities arrived the following morning. The remains were skeletal, scattered, but unmistakably human. A ranger badge lay amongst the bones, and remnants of Ida's journal, worn and faded, confirmed what no one wanted to believe, but everyone had long suspected. Ida Murray had finally been found. But the relief was short-lived. During the forensic examination, experts noted something unusual: deep scoring on the bones of her legs, specifically her femur and tibia. They weren't the bite marks of a mountain lion or wolf. The spacing was wrong, the depth inconsistent. Some teeth impressions were too narrow, others too wide. No predator native to the region could be matched to the wounds. A state anthropologist publicly stated that the damage, quote, could not be positively attributed to any known animal, end quote. Quietly, more unsettling theories emerged, suggesting the marks were made post-mortem, possibly even by something with opposable digits. The phrase was odd and unsettling. Something with hands? Ida's cause of death was ruled inconclusive. Hypothermia, perhaps, a fall, dehydration. But that didn't account for how her body ended up miles from her intended patrol route, over ridges she likely wouldn't have crossed, and without leaving any sign of a struggle. Over the years, her story twisted into local lore. Hikers told tales around the campfire. Some said Ida had been lured off trail by something calling her name. Others claimed she was chased. A few believed she'd discovered something in the wilderness, something she wasn't meant to see. The United States Forest Service quietly closed off the region near her final resting place for, quote, trail repair, though no repair was ever completed. Forest rangers rarely speak of her now, and older ones still pause near the northern ridgelines. Some leave a hand against the trees, as if remembering her presence. Every August, on the anniversary of her disappearance, a small ceremony is held at the Redfish Lake Visitor Center. A bench sits there now, inscribed with Ida's name. New rangers are told her story, not as a warning, but as a reminder that the forest is not ours, that even those who live closest to nature are not exempt from its power. Today, Ida Murray remains a part of the land she loved, as much a mystery as the mountains themselves. Her bones were found, her legacy preserved, but the truth, what really happened in those final moments, lies hidden in the wind through the pines, in the shadows between the trees, in the cold clarity of an alpine morning. Maybe it always will. If you enjoyed these stories, please consider subscribing to the channel. Give it a like, a comment, and maybe a share. But if you didn't like the stories, maybe share it with someone you don't like. In any case, I'm glad you stuck around to the end.